All right, let's get into it. Number 10. The heavy plow. Sometime around the 6th century CE, across the cold, rain-soaked clay plains of northern Europe, farmers began modifying a simple wooden frame in a way that no Roman engineer had ever seriously attempted. They added a vertical iron blade at the front, a horizontal cutting edge below, and a curved board to turn the soil sideways as it broke. The result was the heavy plow. It looked crude. It was, in fact, one of the most transformative agricultural instruments in the history of human civilization. Before it arrived, European farmers relied on the ard, a lightweight scratch plow inherited from the ancient Mediterranean world. The ard worked beautifully in the thin, dry soils of Greece and Rome, but northern Europe was different. Its heavy clay soils were dense, waterlogged, and brutally resistant to shallow scratching. Farmers who tried to cultivate them found the soil closing back over itself almost as fast as they could break it. Entire regions of what would become France, Germany, and England were, for practical purposes, agriculturally useless. The heavy plow changed that equation with three components working in combination. The coulter, a vertical iron blade, sliced vertically through the soil first. The plowshare cut horizontally beneath it. Then, the mold board turned the broken earth sideways, aerating it and burying weeds in a single pass. For the first time, the deep, rich clay soils of northern Europe could be properly worked. Historian Lynn White Jr., writing in his foundational 1962 study, Medieval Technology and Social Change, argued that this tool was the single greatest driver of the medieval agricultural revolution. He was not exaggerating. The consequences were foundational and irreversible. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086 on the orders of William the Conqueror, recorded more than 80,000 plow teams operating across England alone, a figure that reveals how completely the heavy plow had been absorbed into the fabric of medieval life within a few centuries of its adoption. The open field strip farming system that defined the medieval countryside emerged directly from the communal ownership of plow teams, reshaping not just agriculture, but the social structure of rural Europe alongside it. Every cathedral, every walled city, every university that rose in medieval Europe was built on the surplus grain that the heavy plow made possible, and almost none of the people who built those monuments knew the name of the tool that fed them. Some revolutions are quiet. This one was simply indispensable. Number 9. The watermill. When the Domesday Book was compiled in 1086 on the orders of William the Conqueror, its surveyors fanned out across England and recorded everything of economic value in meticulous detail. Among the most striking entries was this: 5,624 watermills operating across the country, serving a population of roughly 1.5 million people. That is approximately 1 mill for every 267 people. And England, remarkable as that figure is, was not even the most heavily milled nation in medieval Europe. Watermills were not a medieval invention. Roman engineers had built them, documented them, and understood their mechanical principles clearly. But Rome treated the watermill as a supplementary device, useful in specific circumstances, but never systematically deployed as the backbone of food production. The reasons were partly economic and partly cultural. Rome ran on slave labor, and slaves were cheaper than engineering. When that labor system collapsed in the post-Roman West, the calculation changed entirely. Monasteries, the great institutional engines of early medieval Europe, stepped into that gap. The Cistercian monasteries of the 12th century became the most aggressive builders and refiners of watermill technology anywhere in Europe. Their approach was systematic and relentless. A single well-constructed mill, channeling water through a properly cut mill race onto an overshot wheel, could grind enough grain to feed a village of roughly 300 people, replacing the backbreaking labor of dozens of workers who had previously ground flour by hand. John Gimple, in his landmark 1976 study, The Medieval Machine, documented how Cistercian houses treated hydraulic engineering as a form of devotion, as painstaking in its execution as any illuminated manuscript. What made the watermill truly epic-defining was what happened next. By the late 13th century, the same wheel and axle principle that ground grain had been adapted to full woolen cloth, to saw timber, and to operate the forge bellows that drove iron production. Documented examples of water-powered forge bellows appear in Catalonia and Styria before 1300 CE. The watermill had become, in effect, the first multi-purpose mechanical energy system in Western history, a single elemental mechanism powering an entire proto-industrial economy. If the Industrial Revolution is defined by the moment humanity first harnessed a non-human, non-animal energy source and put it to systematic, sustained work, then that moment did not happen in 18th century England. It happened in a medieval monastery, beside a diverted stream, powered by nothing more than falling water and an unheralded understanding of what a wheel can do. Number 8. The bellows. Sometime in the 12th century, across the ironworking regions of medieval Europe, blacksmiths began coupling a new device to their forge fires. It was built from leather, wood, and iron fittings, and it operated on a principle of almost contemptible simplicity. You compressed it to push air in, and you expanded it to draw air back. But the large double-action bellows, operated by a second worker, or later by a water-powered mechanism, could blast a sustained column of air into a fire with a force that no human lung could match. And that changed the temperature of everything. Before the large bellows transformed medieval forges, European smiths worked with charcoal fires that burned at temperatures sufficient for basic iron shaping, but insufficient for anything approaching systematic, high-quality metalworking. Roman smiths had been skilled, but they were working within thermal limits that the materials and techniques of antiquity could not break through. The iron they produced was adequate for tools and weapons at the scale Rome required, but it was not produced with the consistency or at the volume that a growing medieval economy, building cathedrals, arming armies, and equipping agricultural expansion was beginning to demand. The large double-action bellows pushed forge temperatures to approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius, a threshold that transformed what was metallurgically possible. At those temperatures, wrought iron could be worked with a precision and consistency unavailable to earlier smiths. R.J. Forbes, in his meticulous, multi-volume Studies in Ancient Technology, documented how bellows-enhanced forges produced iron with carbon content low enough to be cold-worked, bringing European metallurgy to the threshold of true steel production. The Catalan forge, refined with bellows technology through the 12th century, produced iron of a quality that Roman smiths would not have recognized. The consequences were formidable and far-reaching. The blast furnace, which transformed iron production from the 14th century onward and made possible the mass manufacture of iron goods, was entirely dependent on bellows technology for its air supply. Water-powered bellows, coupling the mill mechanism to the forge, appeared at ironworking sites in Styria and Catalonia before 1300 CE. The armor of the Crusades, the ironwork of Gothic cathedrals, and ultimately the cannons that brought the medieval period to its violent close were all products of a thermal revolution that began with a leather pump beside a fire. The bellows did not merely fan a flame. It gave medieval civilization the heat it needed to forge the weapons, the tools, and eventually the machinery that would define the 6 centuries to follow. And almost every iron object that shaped medieval history passed through a fire that bellows made possible. Number 7. The treadwheel crane. In 1225, construction began on the nave of Strasbourg Cathedral, a structure that would eventually rise to 142 meters and hold the title of the tallest building in the world for more than 2 centuries. The men responsible for lifting its stones did not have engines, hydraulic systems, or steel cable. What they had was a large wooden wheel, a rope wound around an axle, and the collective body weight of workers who walked inside the drum like men treading an enormous mill. What they built with those tools still stands. Before the treadwheel crane transformed medieval construction sites, moving heavy stone to significant heights was a problem that consumed enormous quantities of human labor and frequently produced inconsistent, dangerous results. Ancient builders had used rope and pulley ramp systems, sheer brute force, organized at massive scale, the methods visible in the construction of Roman amphitheaters and Egyptian monuments. Those methods worked, but they were slow. They required vast labor forces, and they placed an effective ceiling on how high a structure could practically be built before the logistics of the ramp itself became the dominant engineering problem. The treadwheel crane solved that problem with elegant mechanical economy. Workers entered a large wooden drum wheel and walked forward, converting their body weight into rotational force transmitted through an axle to a winding drum above. The rope attached to that drum could lift loads estimated from surviving examples at Bruges, Harwich, and Cherbourg at up to 750 kilograms per lift. The crane was mounted at the top of the structure under construction, climbing with the walls as they rose, meaning the lifting distance never exceeded what the mechanism could manage. Historian Matthias Pfeiffer documented that this approach reduced cathedral construction labor by an estimated 50% compared to ramp-based alternatives. Without the treadwheel crane, the Gothic cathedral building program that defined medieval European culture from the 12th through the 14th centuries would have been structurally impossible. Chartres, begun in 1194, Notre-Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, and Canterbury all rose on the back of this pivotal mechanism. The soaring verticality that defines Gothic architecture, those towering naves and vaulted choir ceilings that made medieval worshippers feel genuinely small before something greater, was not a spiritual metaphor. It was an engineering achievement made possible by men walking in circles inside a wooden drum. When you stand beneath the vaulted ceiling of a Gothic cathedral and feel the weight of those arches pressing upward toward the light, ask yourself who put them there. The answer is not mystical. It is mechanical, patient, and completely unheralded. Number 6. The astrolabe. In 1391, the English poet Geoffrey Chaucer sat down to write a technical manual. He was not composing verse. He was explaining, in plain and careful English, how to use a brass instrument that could determine the time of day, the altitude of the sun, the positions of the stars, and a navigator's latitude on Earth. He addressed this manual to his 10-year-old son, Lewis. The instrument he was describing was the astrolabe, and Chaucer's Treatise on the Astrolabe remains the earliest technical manual written in the English language. The astrolabe was not a medieval invention in its origins. Its theoretical foundations were Greek, developed by astronomers working in Alexandria as early as the 2nd century CE. But the instrument as medieval Europe came to know it, refined, engraved, and capable of performing approximately 20 distinct astronomical calculations, was the product of Islamic scholarship at its most rigorous and painstaking. It was Gerbert of Aurillac, the future Pope Sylvester II, who introduced the instrument to Western Europe around 980 CE, carrying it back from his studies in Islamic Spain. The oldest surviving complete astrolabe, dated to 927 or 928 CE, is held today in the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford. What made the astrolabe transformative was its compression of centuries of astronomical knowledge into a portable, operable device. Its rotating disc, called the rete, modeled the night sky above a fixed plate, engraved with coordinate lines for a specific latitude. By rotating the rete against the plate and reading the intersections, a literate user could determine the time, the position of any major star, the altitude of the sun at any hour, and the correct times of the Islamic daily prayers, which drove its rigorous refinement across the Islamic world from the 8th century onward. It was the medieval world's most sophisticated calculation engine, and it fit in a coat pocket. Its consequences extended far beyond medieval Europe's borders. The astrolabe provided the navigational framework that made oceanic exploration scientifically possible. Portuguese mariners pushing south along the African coast in the 15th century used astrolabe-based latitude calculation to navigate waters no European chart had ever recorded. The voyages of Bartolomeo Diaz in 1488 and Vasco da Gama in 1497 were made possible by an instrument that carried within it the intellectual inheritance of Baghdad, Alexandria, and Cordoba. Every ship that crossed an ocean during the Age of Discovery carried that inheritance in its navigator's hands, and the world those voyages created, for better and for worse, was traced in the stars by a brass disc that a 10-year-old boy in 14th century England could learn to read. Number 5. The Mason's Compass and Square. In approximately 1230 CE, a master mason named Villard de Honnecourt compiled a remarkable document. It is a portfolio of drawings, geometric figures, architectural details, and mechanical sketches, covering everything from Cistercian church plans to the correct method for cutting a voussoir stone for an arch. Running through every page of his Livre de Portraiture, the most important surviving architectural manuscript of the medieval period, is a single consistent instrument, the compass. It appears in his hands, in his margins, and in his geometry. It was not decorative. It was the tool that made everything else possible. The master masons of medieval Europe did not work from blueprints in the modern sense. They worked from geometric principles encoded in the relationships between circles, squares, and triangles, all of which could be constructed and transferred using only a compass and a straight edge. The two dominant systems, known as ad quadratum and ad triangulum, derived all structural proportions from the diagonal of a square or the height of an equilateral triangle, respectively. These ratios, transmitted through Islamic scholarship from Euclidean geometry, allowed a master mason to scale a building from a small drawn figure to full construction dimensions without performing a single numerical calculation. The genius of this system was its precision under conditions of apparent crudeness. When the builders of Chartres Cathedral, working from 1194 after a catastrophic fire, destroyed its predecessor, set out the proportions of the nave, they were not guessing. They were executing a geometric logic that the compass encoded precisely and the square verified at every course of stone. Exeter Cathedral, whose nave was substantially rebuilt between 1270 and 1370 CE, preserves in its surviving fabric the consistent geometric ratios of compass-based construction measured and confirmed by modern architectural historians, including Lon Shelby, whose 1977 study, Gothic Design Techniques, remains the definitive analysis. The social legacy of these tools extended beyond the building site in ways that permanently shaped Western culture. The Freemasons, whose symbolic heritage traces by tradition to the guilds of cathedral builders in the 12th through 14th centuries, adopted the compass and square as their central emblems. Whatever the precise historical connection, the symbolism is accurate. These were the instruments through which all medieval architectural and engineering knowledge was stored, transmitted, and applied. They were not measuring tools in the modern sense. They were a language. In an age without calculators, blueprints, or engineering degrees, medieval builders raised structures so geometrically exact that modern architects still study their proportions with undisguised admiration. Two iron instruments, a compass and a square, contain the entire mathematical vocabulary of a civilization that built in stone for eternity. Number 4. The spinning wheel. Sometime around 1280 CE, a device arrived in Western Europe from the Islamic world, most likely through the trading networks of Islamic Spain or the commercial routes running through the Eastern Mediterranean. It had originated centuries earlier in India, where textile historians including E.J.W. Barber, writing in her 1994 study, Women's Work the First 20,000 Years, place its earliest use between 500 and 1000 CE. In Europe, it transformed the most universal form of female labor in human history within a single generation. The spinning wheel had arrived, and the European textile economy would never recover its former shape. Before the spinning wheel, thread was produced by the drop spindle, a weighted shaft that the spinner twisted by hand while drawing out fibers from a distaff held under the arm. The drop spindle was ancient, effective, and extraordinarily slow. A skilled spinner working a drop spindle could produce thread at a rate that, for the scale of cloth production a growing medieval economy required, was simply insufficient. Spinning was the bottleneck in the entire cloth-making process, the constraint that kept textile production fundamentally domestic and small-scale, regardless of how efficiently the subsequent steps of weaving and finishing were organized. The spinning wheel broke that bottleneck with mechanical force. A hand-cranked or treadle-operated flywheel maintained consistent rotational speed, driving a spindle that twisted and wound thread at a rate 3 to 4 times faster than a drop spindle in skilled hands. The Flemish and Italian woolcloth industries, the wealthiest manufacturing sectors in 14th century Europe, expanded dramatically following widespread spinning wheel adoption. Among the earliest European commercial documents referencing the spinning wheel are the Lübeck Wool Guild records of 1310, reflecting how rapidly the tool moved from novelty to indispensable foundation of organized production. The consequences extended beyond productivity into the structure of society. As spinning wheels concentrated production and guild structures formalized around the new pace of output, the economic autonomy that individual women had exercised as independent spinners was progressively absorbed into commercial systems from which they were largely excluded. The spinning wheel created wealth at a scale previously impossible. It did not distribute that wealth evenly. The Medici banking empire of Florence, which financed the Renaissance, was built substantially on the profits of the Florentine cloth trade, which the spinning wheel had made possible. Without the spinning wheel, there is no Flemish wool trade, no Medici fortune, no Renaissance. And without the spinning wheel's mechanical principle, James Hargreaves would have had nothing to multiply when he invented the spinning jenny in 1764. The Industrial Revolution ran on a thread that a medieval craftsman first learned to spin faster. Number 3. The mechanical clock. In 1283, the monks of Dunstable Priory in Bedfordshire recorded the installation of a mechanical clock above their rood screen. It was the earliest documented reference to a mechanical clock in England, and possibly in Northern Europe. It did not display the time in any format a modern person would recognize. It regulated the daily schedule of the monastery, dividing the day into the canonical hours of prayer, labor, and rest. What seems from that description like a devotional tool was in fact something far more profound. It was the moment that time became a machine. For the entirety of human history before this point, time had been approximate, local, and organic. Sundials divided the day by shadow. Church bells announced the hour to a parish. The canonical hours of the church varied in length with the seasons, longer in summer, shorter in winter, because they were divisions of daylight rather than divisions of an abstract, equal unit. No two communities in medieval Europe kept precisely the same time, and no mechanism existed that could impose uniformity, even if anyone had wanted it. The verge and foliate escapement, the mechanical heart of the first clocks, appeared in European records between approximately 1275 and 1300 CE, and it changed that situation permanently. Richard of Wallingford, abbot of St. Albans, designed and built an extraordinary astronomical clock between 1327 and his death in 1336, one of the most complex mechanical devices constructed anywhere in medieval Europe. His clock displayed the positions of the sun and moon, the tides, and the nodes of the lunar orbit. It demonstrated what the mechanical escapement made possible, not merely the measurement of time, but the modeling of celestial motion through engineered precision. The Salisbury Cathedral clock, built around 1386 and still operational today, stands as the oldest surviving working mechanical clock in the world, a direct physical survivor of the medieval revolution in timekeeping. Historian David Landis, in his landmark 1983 study, Revolution in Time, made an argument that continues to provoke debate. The mechanical clock, he contended, was more important to the rise of Western capitalism than any other single invention. His reasoning was painstaking and persuasive. The clock did not merely measure time. It transformed time into a commodity, a divisible, purchasable, sellable unit that could be traded for wages, owed to employers, and managed as a resource. Equal hours, mechanically enforced, replaced the elastic canonical hours of the church and imposed a secular, universal grid on European daily life for the first time. Every deadline you have ever missed, every shift you have ever clocked in for, every appointment that has ever made you anxious flows from a decision made in a 13th century English monastery. The monk who installed that first mechanical clock was not measuring time. He was inventing the relentless, foundational rhythm of everything that came after him. Number 2, the printing press. In 1440, in the city of Mainz in the Rhineland, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg began assembling a device from a modified wine press, hand-cast metal type, and an oil-based ink of his own formulation. By 1455, his press had produced approximately 180 copies of the Bible, each one typographically identical, each one printed with a consistency no human scribe could achieve, and each one a quiet act of civilizational disruption that its creator could not fully have anticipated. Of those 180 Gutenberg Bibles, 49 survive today, scattered across the libraries and archives of the world. They are among the most consequential physical objects in human history. Before Gutenberg's press, knowledge in Europe was controlled through scarcity. A skilled scribe working at full capacity could produce 2 to 4 pages of manuscript per day. Books were expensive, rare, and concentrated in the hands of the church, the aristocracy, and the universities. The copying errors that accumulated through successive generations of manuscripts introduced corruptions into texts that no reader could easily detect or correct. Literacy was not merely uncommon. It was, for most of Europe's population, structurally inaccessible because the objects that literacy required were simply too rare and too costly to function as instruments of mass education. Gutenberg's press produced approximately 3,600 pages per day. The arithmetic of that single fact is staggering. By 1500, fewer than 50 years after the Gutenberg Bible appeared, over 1,000 printing presses were operating across Europe, and an estimated 8 million books had been produced, more than European manuscript culture had created in the entire previous millennium, as Elizabeth Eisenstein documented in her foundational 1980 study, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. The price of books collapsed. Literacy became economically viable for a vastly expanded population. And the authority structures that had been built on information scarcity began, with gathering momentum, to collapse alongside that price. The speed of transmission that the press enabled was unlike anything the medieval world had experienced. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in October 1517, his arguments spread across Germany within 2 weeks, and across Europe within 2 months. That propagation speed was physically impossible before Gutenberg. The Protestant Reformation was not merely enabled by the printing press. It was, in its structural irreversibility, a creation of it. No pope, no emperor, and no army could put that particular fire out, once printed text had carried it beyond the reach of any single authority to suppress. The Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the democratic revolutions of the 18th century are all downstream of a goldsmith in Mainz who figured out how to press ink onto paper faster than a monk could pray. The world those movements destroyed has never been rebuilt, and the world they created still runs, in its deepest assumptions, on the logic that Gutenberg's press first made possible. Number 1. The horse collar. For 6,000 years, the engine of human civilization was the ox. Slow, powerful, and tireless, the ox had pulled the plow from Mesopotamia to medieval France, from the river valleys of ancient China to the downlands of Roman Britain. And for 6,000 years, the horse, faster than the ox, stronger over a working day, and more responsive to direction, was agriculturally nearly useless for heavy field work. A single piece of padded leather and shaped wood, the rigid horse collar, changed that. And in changing that, it fed an entire civilization into existence. The problem was not the horse. The problem was the harness. The throat and girth harness that antiquity had inherited from the ancient Near East pressed its load directly against the horse's windpipe and sternum. Under any significant traction force, the horse choked. Researchers working from Lynn White Jr.'s analysis in Medieval Technology and Social Change, published in 1962, and from John Langdon's rigorous 1986 study, Horses, Oxen, and Technological Innovation, estimated that the throat and girth harness reduced the horse's effective pulling power under load by an estimated 80%. The horse that could outrun any ox on open ground could barely drag a loaded cart. The solution arrived from China, where the rigid padded collar had been in use by the 5th century CE, and reached Frankish Europe by approximately 920 CE, first appearing in manuscript illustrations of that period. The rigid collar transferred the load entirely to the horse's shoulders and chest, the bones built to bear it. The animal could lean into its full strength without restriction, combined with the nailed horseshoe, which gave the horse traction on the stone and clay surfaces of northern Europe, where the ox's cloven hoof struggled, and harnessed in front of the heavy plow that had already broken the northern clay soils open. The horse became the most productive agricultural tool in medieval history. Historians estimate that horse-drawn agriculture increased northern European crop yields by 30 to 40% between the 10th and 13th centuries, as the new system of cultivation spread across France, Germany, England, and the Low Countries. The demographic consequences were elemental and transformative. The population of Europe stood at approximately 38 million people in 1000 CE, as estimated by historian David Herlihy from surviving census and tax records. By 1340 CE, on the eve of the Black Death, that figure had grown to approximately 74 million. That near doubling of the human population of a continent in 3.5 centuries was fed by fields that horses plowed, fields that the rigid collar made possible, on a scale that the ox alone could never have achieved. Every university founded in that period, every cathedral built, every city that grew beyond the scale of a market town, every manuscript copied, and every idea transmitted rested on that agricultural surplus. Everything we call medieval civilization, its faith, its philosophy, its architecture, its scholarship, and its wars, was fed by fields that horses plowed. And horses could only plow those fields because an unknown craftsman in an unknown workshop in an unknown year somewhere between Roman China and Carolingian France solved a problem in harness design that 6,000 years of civilization had failed to crack. No chronicler recorded his name. No monument marks his workshop. Some of the most irreversible revolutions in human history have no author. They have only consequences, and we are still living inside them. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.